Dear students, good morning. Welcome to La Excellence IAS. Let us start the discussion on today's newspaper, that is 22nd August 2020. The first article is from Jayant Sinha, that is moving resolutely towards the post-pandemic future. You know that Mr. Sinha is from BJP, is an elected MP from BJP and Minister of State for Finance previously. In this article, he tries to explore what the activities government did and is going to do to fight the COVID-19's health and economic challenges. The first thing is lockdown. Why was the lockdown introduced? How the lockdown has affected the progress of this pandemic? Across the world, many countries have taken up this step of lockdown. Lockdown means freezing the economic and social activities which are existing in a given nation. So, this lockdown is meant to flatten the curve. What is meant by flattening the curve? If all the infections are placed in a particular time frame, then this pandemic can be worse. The healthcare system will not be able to handle the caseload. If these cases are distributed over a time period, the healthcare system can cope up itself. In the meanwhile, we shall be able to procure various kinds of PPE kits, N95, oxygen cylinders, health grade upgradations, everything we have to do. So the lockdown has provided the necessary time for the country to cope up with the challenges posed by the COVID-19. Next, the worst affected of this COVID-19 are poor and marginalized, especially the migrant workers. These people have to be taken care of. What the government decision or what the government initiative, Pradhan Mantri Garib Kalyan Yojana. From PDS system, they started distributing grains free of cost. And other than that, money transfers played an important role in rural economy. For transfer of money, they have used the existing schemes and programs. One is MG Narega. Continuation of MG Narega has fueled the money into the rural economy. Pradhan Mantri Kisan and then National Social Security Assistance Schemes. All these have provided for flow of equivalent to 2 lakh crore rupees into the rural economy. The next, policy decisions, RBI policy decisions. It has decreased the interest rates, policy rates decreased, obviously, the lending rates also have come down. In spite of reduction in lending rates, no one is ready to take a loan at this point of time because of economic uncertainty. But what the people are worried about is repayment of already existing loans. This is where the role of RBI comes role of RBI there. One is restructuring of the loans. One time restructuring of the loans is allowed so that you can correlate your incomes and repay the loans accordingly. Added to that, moratoriums were a great relief, especially for the salaried employees and also small medium enterprises. After this, Atmanirbhar Bharat has come up. It is to encourage self-reliance in economy. Already we saw that close to 101 items of defense sector will be manufactured in India itself, and separate domestic budget is given for defense. In the electronic sector also, incentivization of domestic production is being encouraged, and production linked incentives are being created there. The biggest reform has come up in the agriculture. One is market linkages and providing for Kisan credit to the fishermen and other aquaculture people. And all these things made a big difference. You know that Prime Minister made an announcement to create 1 lakh rupees for rural infrastructure. So, the Jayant Sinha's major statement is the country is being enough cared for. And finally, PSUs are also being disinvested. Labor laws are being diluted. What is the purpose of this? It is to attract the foreign investments. So Atmanirbhar Bharat, a self-reliant Bharat, is not a disconnected Bharat. That is the point we need to remember. So all the PSUs are open for disinvestment now. Only those in strategic sector are being kept aside. These are the points we need to remember in this article. The next is differential impact of COVID-19 and the lockdown. This article talks about how different sections of the society got impacted because of COVID-19. Normally, levelers means the things which can reduce the inequalities in history, these are called levelers. What are those levelers? Wars, revolutions, state collapse, and pandemics. These four are expected to reduce inequalities. Unlike that, COVID 19 is expected to raise inequalities. How? Let us see this. If we understand the pre-existing structures of social disadvantage, then you can understand this particular point. So what are meant by structures of social identity? They refers to gender, caste, religion, etc. So this article explores how the structures of social identity are perpetuating inequalities in the midst of pandemic. Employment, if we observe, there is fall in employment far higher among Dalits compared to upper castes. Similarly, education. The pandemic is expected to exacerbate the existing educational differences. So, technology has become a major bridge to promote the education today. So, in such a case, who have got the access to technology, either a smartphone or internet connection, obviously relatively well off people. The learning outcomes, if they are centered around technology, delivered through technology, access to the poor to the technology and education delivered through the technology will be weak. It is expected to exacerbate further economic inequalities in the future. You know that education becomes a great leveler in the future. Obviously, if quality education is deprived to certain sections of the people, they are expected to be at the bottom of the pyramid on an economic hierarchy. These are the points we need to keep in mind. The next is last lap. You know that Democratic National Convention was conducted and all the big heads of Democratic Party, that is Mr. Bill Clinton, Hillary Clinton, Mr. Obama, all were there at the convention. And Mr. Joe Biden, the former Vice President of US, and Ms. Kamala Harris, these have become the President and Vice President nominees of Democratic Party. In this case, America is never divided like this before. Mr. Obama, when he was the president, he represented more a country that is united. But Mr. Trump was more dividing the country like never before. But however, his mishandling of COVID-19 has brought an opportunities on the front door of Joe Biden. Remember carefully, Mr. Trump's policies are divisive. Second thing, America as a country was never unequal like this before. And most important thing is the mail-in voting is introduced due to pandemic this year. What is mail-in voting? So the people have to give their preferences and post that, which will be counted as a ballot next. In this case, US Postal Services have to play an important role, and US Postal Services work under the President's executive authority. Then Mr. Trump is trying to misuse his executive authority to delay this particular entire exercise. That is what is. Next thing, Trump himself has told that if results are not in favor, probably he may not accept the authority of the new president to transfer the power to him. So it means if election results comes against the Trump, probably these elections are going to be the most messiest in the American history. That's how I'll put it as. The next is repeal and reform. You know that in recent elections in Sri Lanka, SLPP, that is Rajapaksa's party, got 2/3 majority in proportional representation system. That's a big wonder. No party across the world got 2/3 seats in proportional representation system. It means the people are being really worried about the previous regime. So Mr. Sirisena and Vikram Singh's government, they promised big and they delivered nothing. And there are internal strife, always they are fighting in between. And second, huge populistic promises are made by Rajapaksas and majoritarian stance added to this, not just in Sri Lanka, either it is India or in US or in Europe, everywhere the majoritarianism is becoming a vote puller these days. The majoritarian versus minoritarian plank, it is putting the countries onto unrest. But the previous regime had certain successful things. What are these? 19th Constitutional Amendment Act. It has created the checks and balances in executive presidency. What are they? First is, totally 2 terms are allowed for a president. Second, the president cannot dissolve the parliament at its will. So first 4.5 years he cannot dissolve the parliament. Previously it was within the first year you could have done, but it has been extended to 4.5 years now. Independent constitutional institutions are being created outside the authority of the president. These checks and balances are quite essential to ensure a democratic progress or constitutional governance in any country. If these checks and balances are diluted, there is a little difference between elected anarchy or elected autocracy versus elected democracy. So, previously, if you remember, Mr. Shah of Delhi High Court made this statement: India appears to be more like an elected autocracy now. So, in those circumstances, the Sri Lanka will become an elected autocracy without the right institutions. I always tell to the students this: democracy stands on the pillars of institutions, democratic institutions. So, if these pillars collapse, democracy crumbles because there is no strength in that particular democracy. Why Indian democracy was able to stand when all the democracies in South Asia are failing? We have to give the credit to our forefathers who built these institutions with character and wisdom. That's how I will put it as. In this context, the author is trying to say that the Sri Lankan government shall have respect for the institutions and shall not be hasty to take their mandates to curb these institutions that can protect the democracy. Next is a people living off borrowed money. This is also about Sri Lanka. So Sri Lanka is going through a lot of economic crisis. You know that the Rajapaksa's populism is going to eat away that particular government. But however, these external crises it can be better handled with a proper wisdom, and government is taking few steps. Let's observe them. First, external debt of Sri Lanka today stands at 42.6% of GDP. It is in a state that it is taking loans today to service its pre-existing debt. In this case, it is asking for various countries like China, India for debt freeze, and new loans it is requesting for, and sought emergency financial support from IMF, Rapid Credit Facility. After this, internally how the situation is. The situation of Tamils living in tea estates, that is hilly areas, and also east and northern province, their situation is much worse. So in this context, joblessness, growth and development surrounding the major port cities in Sri Lanka has provided huge challenges to these people. So centralized development, urban centric development, development of port cities, this all is going to hurt the distribution of development. It is the time the countries such as India, Sri Lanka, everyone take decentralization of the development seriously, and the development has to move more towards the rural side. Infrastructure has to move more towards the rural side. As early we realize this particular thing, so best for the people. Development needs to be distributed across. That is the point we need to remember through this. Let us come to the Indian elections. Election Commission of India has brought in new guidelines to conduct elections in upcoming months. Remember, Election Commission is the most powerful institutions, and every judge and every court in this country stood by the Election Commission to ensure fairness in elections in India. So, Article 324, which provides for superintendent's direction and control of the elections, is the most powerful article in India. And superintendent's direction and control is as broadly interpreted by the courts to provide independence to this institution. But this institution is always a sore eye for the politicians in power. In this context, especially in the last elections, the Election Commission of India faced the wrath of the opposition like never before, and it was almost declared as partisan. And Mr. Ashok Lavasa, who has got some independent voice, he's recently been appointed as Vice President of ADB, and he resigned to be the Election Commissioner. That is something strange, which never happened before in the history of the Election Commission of India. Keeping all these politics aside, what is the news in this? Today, the guidelines which are provided by the Election Commission are being questioned by the opposition. It can lead to the spread of COVID-19, that's what has been stated. What are these guidelines? Let us briefly see them. Attendees of the meeting shall not exceed as determined by the State Disaster Management Authority. Masks, sanitizers, thermal scanners, glove, face shields, etc. are mandatory. And who will monitor that is a big question over there. Any person with fever or previously diagnosed COVID-19, they will also be allowed to vote as citizens, but they have to vote in the last hour. These are the various guidelines brought in. But when these people press the EVMs, don't you think EVM machines themselves becomes the source of contamination and spread of the infection? That's what Congress talks about. Next is a very good step. MP Mr. Shivraj Singh Chouhan, Chief Minister there, says they are going to take the NRS course. You know, recently Prime Minister announced National Recruitment Agency is being placed or created for Group B, Group C jobs. Now, whatever the scores they are getting in those exams will be used to recruit the people for MP government. Then the students can be spared from various recruitment exams by various state governments. If all the states follow this particular pattern, the students need not prepare for multiple exams that can be stated. Fair criticism of government is not sedition. Remember this point. Here I want to mention about Kedarnath judgment of the Supreme Court. You need to remember carefully. Fair criticism of government is not sedition. Sedition, contempt, all these are the colonial laws. So these sedition charges can put the person behind the bars for at least 3 years. In this case, Kedarnath judgment of the Supreme Court clearly states what is sedition and what is criticism. There is a very thin line between these two. First is, a citizen's fair criticism of government by words, letters or comments do not automatically constitute sedition. Any comment that can incite to violence or public disorder only shall be counted as sedition. If you make some comments towards the government, a fair criticism, which cannot lead to any kind of disorder in the public or any kind of violence, then it cannot be considered as sedition to arrest you. That is what the clarity Supreme Court gave. Here you need to see another side of the coin. Contempt of court is there. Fair criticism also shall not come as contempt of court. Government is very liberal in interpreting the sedition, Supreme Court is very liberal in interpreting the sedition, but it is not very liberal in interpreting the provisions of contempt of court. That is another criticism on the Supreme Court on a different note. Kashmir figures in China-Pak dialogue. This is annual foreign ministers meeting of China and Pakistan, which are said to be brothers and partners. Mr. Z talks Pakistan as brothers and partners. In this context, what China is saying is any unilateral action in Kashmir that can complicate the things, they are opposing it. So that Pakistan's intention is to internationalize the Kashmir, and in the process, the help they want to take is from China, all-weather friend China. Shipments to China are driving export recovery. We have issues with China at borders, but economically still we are very much dependent on each other. Last month there are rises in exports. The major rise has come from China. 78% increase in shipments to China have happened in the last month. Nagaland government faults governor's speech. Is governor an independent authority? That is the first question we shall ask for ourselves. And governor has to speak for his government. If governor himself criticizes his government, then what is it for? This is what exactly happened in Nagaland. Governor Ravi, he has made a statement which can pose his government in bad light. What he stated is Nagaland has abundant human and natural resources, but why is it low on human development indices? Then obviously his government is not performing well. He has expressed his anguish in the Independence Day speech. Finally, come back to social media. Recently, Facebook was accused of being partisan towards the party in power. It is to gain policy favors, which we called as crony capitalism. In this context, Facebook India has clarified that it is impartial, non-partisan, highly truthful with all the virtues in this world. I don't believe in this bullshit. Thank you.